Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
At my wedding dinner, with candles tunneling soft gold across linen and the photographer leaning in to catch a smile that kept refusing to land on my face, my mother lifted her glass with the timing of someone who had practiced in front of a mirror, cleared her throat with that little stage cough she uses when she wants the room to hush, and announced in a voice so sweet it made my back teeth ache that she and my father would be keeping the gift money because, as she put it in a tone meant to sound practical and not predatory, my sister needed it more than I did, which is how a celebration turned into a negotiation in a single breath, and how every eye at our table swiveled from her pearls to my mouth to see if I would make a scene or bless the transaction like a good daughter who knows her place. I felt the old heat, that bright embarrassing flush that memory brings when it arrives uninvited, run up my neck while the clatter of cutlery softened and the band, reading the room with the survival instincts of cruise ship veterans, slid into a quiet nothing that let the words hang there like laundry, and for a beat I considered doing the thing I have always done, which is to swallow hard, say something polite, and pretend it's no big deal so everyone else can finish their salmon without indigestion, except I am not a girl at a birthday party anymore counting candles and nodding when someone says, share. I am a woman in a dress I paid for with overtime and stubbornness who finally married a man who listens, and I could feel him beside me. Steady and warm and very still, as if he were giving my backbone somewhere to lean. Family helps family, my mother continued, head tipped with that saccharine sympathy she saves for other people's wallets, and she gestured toward my sister, who gave the room her best modest shrug in a gown that, when she ordered it, she swore was ivory with a blush undertone, although on the dance floor it kept arguing with the light in a way that made the photographer wince. Amber has always been good at performing reluctance, while hoping the applause is for her, and when a few guests tittered as if this were an eccentric tradition we had forgotten to print on the program, my mother rode the sound like a wave, turned back to me, and added that since Ryan and I were so stable, we would understand how important it was to set our priorities. There is a particular silence that lives inside me, an airless room where I have stored every moment of being talked over, volunteered without consent, or written off as the child who doesn't need help because she'll be fine. And when she said stable, the door to that room swung open and I walked in without tripping, because the thing about spending years as the reliable one is that you learn not to waste throat on shouting when a better sound is your own breath slowing, so I smiled the way polite women smile when they are taking mental notes, thanked her for speaking from the heart, and took a sip of water that tasted like a plan. Ryan's hand found my knee under the table and stayed there, calm in a way that broadcast nothing and everything, and while my mother waited for me to co-sign her little redistribution scheme, he reached for his jacket pocket with the unhurried ease of a man retrieving car keys, except what he pulled out was an envelope the color of raw cream, thick enough to matter, sealed with the same tidy discipline he uses to label our moving boxes. And he set it on the table between the candles and the centerpiece peonies as if he were returning a library book on time, which is when my father, who hates conflict almost as much as he hates not keeping score, cleared his throat and said perhaps we could talk about this later, only my mother had already leaned in, scent of gardenia and victory, and said that now is fine because transparency keeps families close. Before anyone opened anything, I looked around the room we had negotiated into existence over months of emails and boundary setting, a room where the seating chart had been my first quiet rebellion. I had refused to put my mother at the center table with her cheerleaders from church, and instead placed her beside my Aunt Linda, who loves me in a way that is not performative and who once told me that when people tell you what you deserve they are usually inventorying what they intend to take, and I felt the steadiness of that choice sit down in my chest like a brick that holds a tablecloth steady when the door keeps opening. I said, evenly, that gifts were given to us and we would handle them like adults handle their own mail, and if anyone wanted a tax receipt there was a basket by the guest book where they could drop a note with their address, which made a few friends from work hide smiles behind their napkins because they know my voice when it opens the drawer labeled enough, and my mother, hearing steel where she expected sawdust, changed tactics so quickly you could almost hear the shift, telling the table That, of course, we could discuss logistics, but in the spirit of family, she and my father had already taken care of certain things to relieve us of stress, like speaking with a few relatives about consolidating checks, and that was when Ryan, without theatrics, said, "Perfect timing," in that gentle, humane way he has when someone is balancing on a thin excuse and thinks it's a bridge. He tapped the envelope once with his index finger, not a flourish, more like a doorbell, and told my parents we had accounted for exactly this possibility because we love family, too, and it is amazing how love can organize a person. Then he slid the envelope toward my mother with a little push that stopped just in front of her plate, and while Amber adjusted a bracelet that may or may not have still had a price tag tucked under the clasp, my father reached for a butter knife as if forming a plan to use it as a letter opener, and the whole room performed that collective inhale people do right before a toast. Except this wasn't a toast, it was a pause shaped like a question. I didn't touch Ryan's hand, because touching it would have said too much, and I didn't look at my mother, because looking might have set off a reaction I wasn't ready to manage, so I watched the flame of the nearest candle bend toward the envelope as if curious. And I let my voice float over the table in that calm register therapist's practice, thanking everyone for coming, for showing up for our future, for believing that a marriage is built by two people who learned the hard way how to keep doors closed when the wind is pushy, and then I said that whatever was inside belonged exactly where it was, in the light, and my mother, who cannot resist center stage even when the furniture is bolted down, slipped a finger under the flap and lifted. And the hush that fell wasn't the polite kind anymore. Long before the waiter's tray trembled over the edge of my mother's announcement, and the room decided to hold its breath for sport, there was the slow, steady apprenticeship that every overlooked daughter serves when she grows up beside a sister who is praised like a season and forgiven like weather, and if I am telling this cleanly it is because I have had years to watch the way generosity can be shaped into a leash, the way concern can be spoken like a tax, and the way a girl can be taught that competence is not a virtue but an excuse to deny her help in the name of fairness that never once arrived with both shoes on. In our house, I was the one who could be trusted to make a sandwich, to call the mechanic, to figure out which cable went into which dusty port without electrocution, and I learned early that being trusted often means being used. Because while my mother polished Amber's language about dreams and deadlines, explaining to any adult with an ear that delicate people need a different kind of scaffolding, she treated my work ethic like a self-cleaning oven that required no detergent, only more pans. I kept asking for the kind of attention that doesn't arrive with a ledger attached, and I kept getting told how impressive it was that I didn't need it, which is not a compliment so much as a plan to keep the family's labor costs low. At school, the pattern translated with insulting fluency, because the counselor who told me I was self-directed also suggested I let my sister tag along to my campus tour and share books to save money. And the aunt who said she admired my backbone also asked whether I could maybe co-sign a small thing later once I had a real job. And when I won a scholarship that would have made a banner on anyone else's lawn, my mother nodded, as if I had finally done something predictable and said this would free up funds for Amber's first apartment since roommates make her anxious, and while I could feel anger press a thumbprint into my ribs, I smiled and filed the moment beside the others. Because my survival has always depended on remembering everything while pretending to remember nothing. I dated men who mistook my competence for convenience and learned to leave before my calm became their excuse, and by the time Ryan arrived with his ridiculous patience and the habit of listening as if I were telling him which wire not to cut, I had developed the unsexy skill of explaining boundaries in declarative sentences that did not tremble, so when my mother offered her services as executive producer of our wedding, complete with a spreadsheet of traditional responsibilities, in which our gifts floated toward a family pool for later distribution, based on emergent needs, I thanked her for the document, made a copy for my own folder, and proceeded to lock every vendor contract to my signature and Ryan's. Paid from an account with a password my sister could not guess even if she scrolled my birthdays backward. The months before the ceremony unspooled like a test with extra credit for restraint, Amber arrived at the boutique claiming that her dress was technically not white but an antique ivory that photographs more champagne than bridal. My mother steered seating assignments so that the people who clapped for her sat where the cameras would find them first, and I learned that if I said no directly she called me stubborn, while if I said no gently she called me ungrateful, which leaves a woman choosing between two versions of the same indictment, and I decided that compliance is just delay wearing perfume, so I became meticulous in ways that looked like politeness and felt like preparation. There was the bridal shower where my mother arranged a sweet little table labeled blessings and gifts and stationed herself like a toll booth, and there was the family brunch where she practiced a toast about how Ryan and I were so fortunate to have stability that we could share, and there were the rehearsed jokes about how Amber always gets cold feet about money decisions, and how tender that makes her spirit, and it would be dishonest to pretend I did not, on a few late nights, imagine standing up and listing receipts like a prosecutor. Yet the other truth is that power lasts longer when it looks effortless, so I designed my refusals to resemble grace. And I let hints fall where people could pick them up later and swear they had found them on their own. I booked the lighting designer myself and asked, with professional politeness, whether we could favor a warmer palette that would flatter true whites while muting off-whites into a comfortable dusk, because candlelight, if you do it right, softens what tries too hard. I ordered place cards through a friend who is allergic to bullying and had them reprinted when my mother accidentally swapped two families who once sued each other over a fence, and I put Aunt Linda at my mother's elbow where compassion goes to drink water and tell the truth. I updated the registry so every digital contribution routed through a link that authenticated to our joint account and displayed a charming thank you note immediately, while a decoy envelope labeled Couples Keepsakes sat by the guest book and collected nothing more valuable than wish cards, which my mother could count for comfort if counting felt like control. My favorite small act, the one that tasted like laughter even while I kept a straight face, happened at the final fitting, when Amber announced with theatrical reluctance that her antique ivory with blush undertone gown made her feel like an angel, but not in a bridal way, and asked, palm up, whether my photographer could adjust tones on the day so I don't, pop, and I said warmly that we would absolutely make sure the camera told the truth, which is exactly what the camera did. Under warm gels that made my dress look like definition and hers look like a thoughtful cloud. And if anyone noticed that the cloud drifted out of frame in most group shots, that was only because the timeline ran on time for once and the bride was not required to chase chaos. None of these moves were cruel, and none of them announced themselves with a cymbal crash, yet each one loosened a knot I had worn for years, and each one taught me again that revenge is sometimes just a boundary with good lighting. Still, as the rehearsal dinner ended and my mother's jokes about pooling gifts for the good of the family sharpened a notch, Ryan looked at me across the table with that mild, infuriatingly steady gaze that means he is already building a solution in his head, and he asked, too quietly for anyone else to hear, whether I thought she would try something on the night itself, and I told him I did not think so. Not exactly, because try implies effort and expectation needs none, which is why, before I slept, I took out a clean envelope. I wrote our names on the front with a hand that did not shake, and I began filling it with the kind of paper that changes how a room behaves when opened. On the morning of my wedding, I stood in front of a full-length mirror in the quiet of the bridal suite, not looking at the dress, but at my face, studying the small tension in my jaw and the almost invisible furrow above my left brow. A line I had seen in my mother's face 100 times, though in her it always seemed like a permanent feature carved by disappointment rather than contemplation. The dress fit perfectly, it should have, considering the number of fittings, the quiet alterations, the choice to avoid anything that my mother could call too revealing or too plain, depending on the day. But what struck me wasn't the gown or the flowers or the hairstyle I had rehearsed into muscle memory. It was the strange, grounded calm humming under my skin, like I had slipped into something more substantial than satin. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't even excited in the giddy, sparkling way people imagine brides should be. I felt ready in a way that went far beyond the ceremony, beyond the carefully chosen vows or the seating chart that had caused 3 passive-aggressive text threads to catch fire. I had spent years learning how to make people comfortable, to minimize my reactions, to bend toward expectation with a smile, and in the weeks leading up to the wedding, I had started, very quietly, to unlearn that. My mother's involvement in the planning had been carefully contained, like a candle in a glass hurricane lamp, pretty from a distance, but not to be trusted too close to paper. She had opinions on everything from linen colors to entree selections, always presented as if she were simply trying to help elevate things a bit, though the undercurrent was always control, draped in charm. She insisted that Amber be my maid of honor, not because we were close, but because family unity looks good in photos. I agreed with the kind of nod that doesn't mean agreement so much as surrender, knowing full well what my sister would do with the attention. And Amber, like clockwork, delivered her performance in full color. She made dramatic sighs about how her dress clashed with her skin tone, joked loudly about how she could never compete with the bride, while clearly daring someone to tell her otherwise, and told every vendor she spoke to that she was basically co-planner, although she hadn't sent a single email or paid for a single item. She floated through the rehearsal with a practiced helplessness that earned her more praise than I had gotten after 3 months of spreadsheet logistics and vendor wrangling. Ryan, to his credit, kept me from slipping into resentment by narrating these absurdities with the dry wit of a man who has spent years in corporate boardrooms and knows how to translate chaos into strategy. When Amber accidentally wore white to our engagement dinner, he whispered, "Next time let's go with a camouflage theme, see how she handles that." When my mother suggested we pool the gift money for the good of both girls, Ryan simply asked, "Should we invoice her now or wait until after dessert?" I laughed, but I knew we were both keeping score. What my mother never fully grasped was that her need to redistribute generosity, to siphon blessings from one child to cushion the life of another, wasn't invisible to me. It had formed the backdrop of every milestone I reached, every quiet success she dismissed as lucky or just Claire being Claire, as if effort had nothing to do with it and I had merely stumbled into achievement while Amber deserved praise for surviving her own messes. I had learned to document everything. Not out of spite, but because the truth doesn't hold much weight when the narrative is already written in someone else's handwriting. Every payment for the wedding was backed up. Every check was deposited into a separate account, joint only between me and Ryan. Even the card box at the reception was locked, its key resting inside Ryan's jacket pocket, just in case someone had the bright idea to streamline the collection process. That morning, before anyone else arrived, I sat at the head table alone for a few minutes, imagining how the night would unfold. I visualized the clink of glasses, the swell of the first dance, the laughter of friends who had flown in from states away. I imagined my mother's inevitable toast, not because she loved public speaking, but because she loved being the center of a story. I knew she would make it about family. I knew she would, in some sideways fashion, frame our wedding as a group effort, with herself as the silent architect. And I knew she wouldn't be able to resist the gift money. That knowledge didn't ruin the day. It refined it. It made each moment sharper, each decision more deliberate. I didn't build our wedding to impress her or even to prove her wrong. I built it to stand on its own. To be proof, to myself, more than anyone, that I could hold the line without shouting. That I could create something beautiful without letting her paint over it. Just before I walked down the aisle, Ryan handed me the envelope. It was heavier than I expected. Inside wasn't just a printout of every digital gift transaction or the full total of the physical checks we had already deposited, though all of that was in there. Tucked between the pages was something Ryan had added on his own, a signed agreement from his lawyer confirming that the money was legally ours, with a copy for each of us. This, he said, adjusting my veil like a man who'd done it before in 1,000 small ways, is not just a paper trail. It's a map. So if they try to pull you into guilt or obligation tonight, just follow it back to us. The envelope stayed in his pocket until dinner. And when my mother stood up with her wine glass and that careful expression she wears when she's about to sound generous, but mean it in reverse, I knew exactly when she was going to say it. I didn't even flinch. I just watched her lips form the sentence I'd already written a reply for. Because when you've spent your life being told that being responsible means going without, eventually you learn that your silence has more power than their applause. And that envelope, sitting quietly between the candles, was about to speak louder than all of them. The envelope landed on the table without drama, without flourish, without even the satisfying thump that paper sometimes makes when it carries weight. It simply arrived, placed between the peonies and the empty dessert plate with the kind of deliberate calm that doesn't ask for attention because it already owns the room. For a moment, nobody moved. The clinking had stopped. The background laughter dissolved like sugar in water. The band hadn't even noticed that the energy had shifted, still playing something soft and forgettable under the murmur of dinner conversation. But our table had gone still, like someone had hit pause in the middle of a play and the actors weren't sure if they should freeze or improvise. My mother, never one to let silence go unfilled unless it served her, reached for the envelope with a tight smile and the dainty grace of someone opening a birthday card at a table full of strangers. She didn't even ask what it was. She just assumed it belonged to her. Of course she did. That had always been the rhythm, her reaching, me retreating, her rewriting the rules mid-sentence and expecting applause for her flexibility. But this time, I didn't flinch, didn't explain, didn't stall or soften the moment with humor or distraction. I sat back, folded my hands in my lap, and waited. Amber leaned forward, her mouth already pulling into that rehearsed smirk she used when pretending to be confused, but secretly thrilled by drama that wasn't her fault, yet. My father, who had spent most of the evening nursing a drink and avoiding any real eye contact, stiffened like he'd just remembered the last time someone handed him something that came with a cost. And Ryan, didn't so much as blink. He just nodded once at my mother and said, with the steady composure of a man who double-checks every exit and never forgets where the fire extinguishers are, "We figured it might come up." The flap lifted with the careful fingers of someone who expects a check or a thank you note, not a loaded fuse, and as the first page emerged, I watched her face the way you'd watch a storm approach from across the field, not with fear exactly, but with that primal mix of anticipation and awe, because there's something quietly satisfying about seeing chaos arrive exactly where it was summoned. She didn't speak at first. Just scanned the top line, then the second, and then again, slower, like repetition might shift the meaning. But words on paper don't bend the way people do, and by the time she reached the second page, the color had begun draining from her face in slow-motion waves, as if the truth were being wrung out of her skin line by line. Amber, impatient with the delay, leaned closer and whispered, "What is it?" like a child at a door she isn't supposed to open, but my mother didn't answer. Not right away. Instead, she looked up at me, not with rage or even confusion, but with something harder to name, something that looked very much like disbelief laced with insult. The expression of someone who just discovered the vending machine is empty and still had the audacity to feel personally robbed. Inside the envelope was a comprehensive summary of every financial contribution related to the wedding, organized by date, type, source, and amount, a tidy archive of generosity accounted for. Signed and notarized 3 days earlier by Ryan's friend Daniel, who happened to be an attorney and who took genuine pleasure in paperwork that made people nervous. But that wasn't the real blow. What twisted her mouth into something brittle was the final document, a formal agreement, countersigned by both of us, stating that all wedding-related gifts, monetary or otherwise, were the sole property of the bride and groom and not subject to third-party claims, reassignment, or family negotiation. We didn't include it because we expected legal recourse. We included it because sometimes the illusion of consequence is enough to stop people from attempting what they were already halfway through doing. My mother blinked. Once. Then again. She set the papers down, adjusted her necklace like it had started to choke her, and said, "You went to a lawyer?" Her voice was quieter now, not soft but smaller, like the sound of someone trying not to admit that the wind had shifted against them. Ryan nodded. "We did. Just to keep things clean." My father, ever the diplomat when confronted with discomfort, chuckled under his breath and muttered something about kids these days, but he didn't touch the papers. Didn't even look at them, which told me everything. He knew. Maybe not the contents, maybe not the exact wording, but he had known something was coming, and he decided long ago to let my mother walk into it alone if it ever came to that. Amber looked from the envelope to me and said, louder than necessary, "This is overkill." You're acting like someone was trying to rob you. I looked back at her, let the pause stretch just long enough to make the table uncomfortable, and said, "No one has to rob you when you hand things over willingly. But we're done handing things over." The words weren't sharp, not cruel or shouted, but they landed with precision. A woman at the next table turned subtly in her chair. A cousin I barely spoke to anymore raised his eyebrows. The band paused between songs. The moment had rippled far enough to register. My mother pressed the papers into the envelope again, folded the flap back over with a hand that trembled just slightly, and said, "Well, I suppose we misunderstood the tone of this evening." And Ryan, never missing his cue, smiled and replied, "It happens." Later, after the plates had been cleared and the music softened into the kind of background blur that means the party is about to end or begin again somewhere quieter, I found the envelope back on our table untouched. She hadn't taken it. Hadn't returned it, either. Just left it there, as if it might still rewrite itself, given enough time. But documents, like people who've stopped apologizing for being right, don't rewrite themselves. They simply wait to be read again louder. The next morning arrived not with the peace I had expected after a wedding, no soft exhale, no sunrise wrapped in silk, no romantic haze of having crossed some final threshold into womanhood, but with a sharp, clean awareness that something fundamental had shifted, not just between me and my mother, but within myself. I woke before Ryan, not because I was restless or disturbed, but because I was alert in a way that felt new, like my body had decided that peace wasn't the absence of conflict, but the presence of clarity, and I had finally tasted both. The envelope was gone, but I hadn't moved it. At some point during the night, maybe while we danced, maybe after the last guests wandered out to waiting Ubers, maybe while the staff packed up the remains of centerpieces and scattered name cards, someone had taken it. I didn't feel panicked or invaded. I felt finished. That envelope had done what it came to do. It had been seen, read, and left behind, and now it lived somewhere else in their story, not mine. My phone lit up 3 times during breakfast, each time with a different flavor of message. The first was from my father, short and stiff, apologizing if there was a miscommunication last night and saying he hoped we could all laugh about it eventually. The second was from Amber, a chaotic string of texts that started with "WDF was that?" and moved quickly into "You really embarrass Mom," then pivoted to "Whatever, I hope you're happy," and finally landed, predictably, on a passive-aggressive send-off. "Don't bother replying, I'm blocking you for now." I didn't respond to either of them. The third message, however, I read twice. It was from my mother. No emojis. No pretense of small talk. Just a sentence she had never sent me before. "You made your point." Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "Let's talk." Just an acknowledgement that, for once, her narrative had been interrupted in public, on record, with witnesses, and there was no graceful way to rewrite it. That was, in its own way, a kind of surrender. Not full defeat, but a signal that the rules had changed, and she knew I wouldn't be playing the old game anymore. We didn't cut off contact after that, not officially. There were no dramatic declarations, no flaming bridges. But something quieter, and, perhaps, more permanent, settled between us like glass between 2 rooms. She still sent birthday texts. She still asked for holiday photos. But the assumptions were gone. The entitlement to my decisions, my money, my patience, that had dissolved in the silence after that dinner, and even if she never admitted it out loud, she had stopped reaching with the same casual confidence she once carried like perfume. What I hadn't expected, though, was how the rest of the family reacted. Some cousins messaged me days later to say they had noticed the shift and had always suspected things weren't as equal in our house as they'd been led to believe. An aunt, not Linda, but one who usually kept her opinions laminated, sent a card with a handwritten note that simply read, "You did what needed doing." Quiet strength runs in the blood. Even one of my childhood neighbors, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, but who had somehow found their way into a table near the back, emailed to say, "I've never seen someone handle a moment like that without raising their voice." It was art. I didn't need the praise. But it reminded me that silence, when chosen, carries a resonance louder than any speech. And the envelope, simple as it was, had done more than protect our wedding gifts. It had drawn a line between my past and my future, a firm, undeniable line that no one could pretend not to see. Ryan and I went on our honeymoon without checking in. We didn't post anything. We didn't answer texts. We hiked through green hills and swam in clear, cold water and cooked in small kitchens where the olive oil was better than anything we'd ever bought at home. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to explain myself, not to my husband, not to my family, and not to the version of me that had spent her 20s negotiating her value in someone else's currency. One night, over a bottle of wine on a quiet terrace, Ryan asked if I thought they'd ever try something like that again, not just the money, but the emotional sleight of hand, the guilt draped as tradition. I watched the candle flicker between us and said, maybe. But next time, they won't find the same girl waiting. He nodded, and that was enough. No vows. No declarations. Just a shared understanding that we had walked through a test and come out aligned, not just as partners, but as people who had drawn the same line in the sand and were willing to hold it. We returned to a life that looked the same on the outside, but felt different under the skin. I didn't have to make a speech at Thanksgiving when the table got quiet. I didn't have to explain the seating arrangement at Christmas when my mother was at the far end. I didn't even have to revisit the envelope. It had done its job. It had spoken. And in the months that followed, whenever someone asked about the wedding, about how beautiful it was, or how magical it must have felt to marry the right person, I always smiled and said, it was everything I needed it to be. Because it was. Not perfect. Not fairy tale sweet. But honest. Deliberate. And free from the weight of inherited obligation. In the end, I didn't keep the envelope. I didn't frame it, or hide it in a drawer, or make it a symbol. I shredded it one afternoon while cleaning, not out of anger or regret, but because it had already changed everything it was meant to change. And once a weapon has served its purpose, you don't carry it around like a trophy. You let it go, knowing it did what words never could.